Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, I wanted to take just a moment to talk about something that really makes a difference for this channel. If you're enjoying the content we create here at Sleep Theories, using your hype points on this video helps us out more than you could possibly know. It genuinely supports what we do and helps us keep bringing you these stories every week. If you're listening over on Spotify, leaving a review would mean the world to us. It helps other listeners find the channel too, and if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone's listening from. It's one of the best parts of doing this. Oh, and if you're new here and you end up enjoying tonight's story, consider subscribing. We've got plenty more where this came from. Alright, let's get into it. It was supposed to be a routine drive. Just another Tuesday in September of 1994, another shift behind the wheel for Michael Brennan, another 800 miles of desert highway between Los Angeles and Salt Lake City. He'd been running this route for 6 years, hauling electronics, packaged goods, whatever the dispatch sheet told him to haul. The job was monotonous, but it paid well, and Michael had gotten used to the solitude. He was somewhere between Barstow and the Nevada state line, on a stretch of Highway 15 that cuts through the Mojave Desert like a razor through paper. Flat, empty. The kind of landscape that makes you understand why the government puts its secrets out here. It was just after 2 in the afternoon when he saw the convoy. 2 black Chevrolet Suburbans and a white Peterbilt flatbed truck, moving in tight formation about a quarter-mile ahead. Michael had seen military convoys before. They were common enough on these desert routes. But something about this one felt different. The vehicles were travelling slowly, maybe 55 miles per hour in a zone where most traffic moved at 70 or above. They stayed in perfect formation, the kind of precision that suggested either military discipline or something more deliberate. As Michael closed the distance, he could see the cargo on the flatbed. It was covered with a dark green tarp secured with heavy-duty straps, but the wind had caught one corner and pulled it partially loose. Underneath, Michael could see something smooth and curved. Metallic, but not in the way steel or aluminum catches light. This was darker, matte, almost like it was absorbing the sunlight rather than reflecting it. The shape was wrong. Michael had been hauling freight for long enough to recognise standard cargo profiles. He knew what aircraft fuselages looked like under tarps. He knew what missiles looked like, what radar dishes looked like, what industrial equipment looked like when it was being transported to remote sites. This didn't look like any of those things. It was circular, maybe 20 feet in diameter. The edges were smooth, beveled, with no visible seams or panel lines, no wings, no tail section, no engine housings. Nothing that suggested it was part of something larger. It looked complete. Michael reached for the Kodak disposable camera he kept in the glove compartment. He'd bought it a few weeks earlier, thinking he might photograph some of the desert landscapes during his drives. He'd never actually used it, until now. He steered with his left hand and brought the camera up with his right, aiming through the windshield as best he could while maintaining speed. The convoy was still ahead, still moving in that slow, deliberate formation. Michael pressed the shutter button 3 times, advancing the film between each shot, trying to capture the flatbed and its cargo before the convoy pulled too far ahead or the tarp shifted back into place. Then the lead Suburban's brake lights flashed. The convoy began to slow. Michael eased off the accelerator, creating distance. He'd learned early in his trucking career not to crowd official-looking vehicles. Too many questions, too much hassle. As the convoy slowed to 40 miles per hour, Michael passed them in the left lane, keeping his eyes forward, trying to look like just another driver who hadn't noticed anything unusual. But as he pulled ahead, he glanced in his side mirror. One of the Suburbans had moved into the left lane behind him. It stayed there for maybe 2 miles, matching his speed exactly, before dropping back and returning to formation with the convoy. Michael kept driving. His heart was pounding. His hands were sweaty on the steering wheel. He told himself it was nothing. Just a convoy transporting classified equipment. Probably aerospace hardware heading to one of the test ranges in Nevada. Nothing to worry about. but he couldn't shake the image of that shape under the tarp. Smooth, seamless, wrong. When he reached his delivery point in Salt Lake City, the next morning Michael dropped off his load, filed his paperwork and drove to a Walgreens to develop the film. The clerk told him it would be ready in an hour. Michael bought a cup of coffee from the gas station next door and waited in his truck, trying to convince himself that the photos would show nothing, that the distance had been too great, that the angle had been wrong, that whatever he'd seen would be too blurry, too indistinct to matter. When he picked up the prints, his hands were shaking. The first photo was useless, motion blur. The second showed the convoy, but the cargo was too far away to make out any detail. The third photo was different. It showed the flatbed truck clearly. The tarp was visible, pulled partially loose on one side, and underneath you could see the edge of something circular. Dark, smooth. The curve of the object was unmistakable, and even in the grainy film photograph you could tell it wasn't a conventional piece of equipment. Michael stared at that photograph for a long time. Then he put it in an envelope, sealed it, and put the envelope in a drawer in his apartment. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't call the newspapers. He didn't contact UFO research groups or military watchdog organisations, because Michael Brennan understood something that most people don't. Some things you're not supposed to see, and when you do see them, you're supposed to keep your mouth shut. This is his story, the story of what happened in the weeks and months after that photograph was taken. The story of how a single image opened a door that Michael had never wanted opened. The story of how the government handles people who see things they shouldn't. And the story of what was really on that truck rolling through the desert in September of 1994. Chapter 1. The Highway. Through the Black Projects. To understand what Michael saw that day, you need to understand the road he was driving on. Highway 15 is one of the major transportation corridors connecting Southern California to the interior western states. It runs from San Diego through Los Angeles, into the Mojave Desert, through Las Vegas, and continues north through Utah and into Montana. For most drivers, it's just another interstate, a route to get from one city to another. But for the Department of Defense, for aerospace contractors, for the network of classified facilities scattered across the Southwest, Highway 15 is something else entirely. It's an artery. The highway passes within striking distance of some of the most sensitive military installations in the United States. Fort Irwin National Training Center sits just north of Barstow, a massive army base where mechanized units train for desert warfare. Nellis Air Force Base sprawls across the desert northeast of Las Vegas, home to advanced tactical training and the Air Force Weapons School. And beyond Nellis, connected by roads that don't appear on most maps, sits the Nevada Test and Training Range, over 4,000 square miles of restricted airspace and controlled ground access, the largest contiguous block of military-controlled land in the United States. Somewhere in that range, at coordinates the government has never officially acknowledged, sits a facility known by many names: Paradise Ranch, Dreamland, Watertown Strip, Groom Lake. The rest of the world calls it Area 51. Highway 15 doesn't go directly to Groom Lake. No public road does, but it connects to the network of secondary highways and access roads that do. And that means when something needs to be moved from a contractor facility in California to a testing site in Nevada, Highway 15 is often part of the route. In 1994, this network was actively being used to transport some of the most advanced aerospace technology ever developed. The F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter had been operational for several years, but the public still knew relatively little about it. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber was in the final stages of testing. Classified programs that wouldn't be revealed for another decade were already in development. All of that technology had to get from the factory floor to the test range somehow, and trucking it through the desert was often the safest, most secure method. Michael Brennan knew this, at least in general terms. Anyone who drove these routes regularly knew that military convoys were common. You saw them at night mostly, covered loads, armed escorts, vehicles with government plates but no other identifying markings. The protocol was simple. You gave them space, you didn't ask questions, and you didn't take photographs. Michael had followed that protocol for 6 years without incident. until September 20th, 1994, the day he saw something that didn't fit any of the categories he understood. Chapter 2. The Shape That Shouldn't Exist. Michael didn't sleep well that night. He checked into a motel in Salt Lake City after picking up the photographs, a cheap place off the interstate where truckers often stayed between runs. The room was clean enough, the bed was adequate, and normally Michael would have been asleep within 20 minutes of lying down. But he kept thinking about the photograph, about the shape under the tarp, about the way it had looked so smooth, so seamless, so unlike anything he'd seen transported before. He'd hauled loads past Edwards Air Force Base, past China Lake, past the Tonopah Test Range. He'd seen the silhouettes of experimental aircraft under tarps, the angular shapes of stealth prototypes, the elongated profiles of missiles and drone fuselages. This had been different. It had been circular, symmetrical, with no visible protrusions, no control surfaces, no features that suggested it was designed to fly through the atmosphere in any conventional sense. Michael got out of bed around 3 in the morning and retrieved the envelope from his duffel bag. He turned on the bathroom light and looked at the photograph again. The image was grainy, shot through a windshield with a disposable camera at highway speed, but certain details were undeniable. The object on the flatbed was roughly 20 feet in diameter. The visible edge showed a smooth curve with what appeared to be a slight bevel, like the rim of a bowl turned upside down. The surface was dark, non-reflective, with no visible panel lines or fasteners. Most tellingly, there were no attachment points, no mounting hardware, no cradle or shipping fixture designed to secure it to the flatbed. It was just sitting there, as if it weighed exactly the right amount to stay stable through inertia alone, as if its centre of gravity was so perfectly balanced that additional restraints weren't necessary. Michael had transported enough heavy equipment to know that wasn't how freight worked. You secured everything. You used straps, chains, blocks, whatever it took to ensure the load couldn't shift during transport. But this object appeared to be resting on the flatbed with minimal restraint beyond the tarp itself. Either it was incredibly heavy, so heavy that moving it was impossible, or it was designed in a way that made conventional securing methods unnecessary. Neither explanation made sense. Michael put the photograph back in the envelope and returned to bed, but sleep didn't come. His mind kept running through possibilities, trying to fit what he'd seen into some framework he could understand. A satellite component, a radar dish, a prototype aircraft fuselage, a wind tunnel test article, a piece of industrial machinery being transported to a remote site. None of it fit. By the time dawn broke, Michael had made a decision. He was going to keep the photograph to himself. He wasn't going to show it to anyone, wasn't going to report it, wasn't going to do anything that might draw attention to what he'd seen. Because in 1994, if you saw something the government didn't want you to see, the smart move was to forget about it, and Michael considered himself a smart man. But over the following days, as he drove back to Los Angeles on his return route, as he picked up another load and headed east again, he couldn't stop thinking about it, about the convoy, about the shape under the tarp, about the way the Suburban had followed him for those 2 miles, watching before dropping back. Had they known he'd taken photographs? Had they seen the camera? And if they had, what would they do about it? Chapter 3. The Man in the Parking Lot. Michael's next run was scheduled for the following week. Los Angeles to Denver, carrying automotive parts for a warehouse distributor. It was a straightforward route. Nothing unusual, the kind of job Michael could do in his sleep. He picked up the load on a Monday morning, checked the manifest, secured the cargo, and headed out of Los Angeles on Interstate 10, planning to connect to Interstate 15 near San Bernardino and continue north through the desert. It was at the truck stop in Barstow during a routine fuel stop that Michael first noticed the man. He was standing near the payphones at the edge of the parking lot. Tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing a dark suit that seemed absurdly formal for a desert truck stop. He had short hair, government short, and he was wearing sunglasses despite the fact that it was early evening and the sun was already low on the horizon. The man wasn't doing anything, just standing there, looking in Michael's direction. Michael finished fueling, paid at the counter, and walked back to his truck. As he climbed into the cab, he glanced toward the payphones. The man was gone. Michael told himself it was nothing, just someone waiting for a ride, a stranded motorist, a businessman whose car had broken down. But the man had been wearing a suit, in Barstow, at a truck stop. That wasn't nothing. Michael pulled out of the parking lot and merged back onto Highway 15, heading north. He checked his mirrors constantly, looking for the black Suburban, looking for anything that suggested he was being followed. There was nothing, just normal traffic, cars, trucks, RVs, the usual flow of vehicles moving through the desert. Michael made it to Denver without incident, dropped his load and filed his paperwork. He had 2 days off before his next run, so he checked into a motel and tried to relax. On the second day, he went to a diner for breakfast. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, coffee. Standard road food. He sat in a booth near the window, reading a newspaper someone had left behind. When he looked up, the man in the suit was sitting in a booth across the diner. Same dark suit, same sunglasses, same expressionless face. The man wasn't eating. He wasn't drinking coffee. He was just sitting there, looking in Michael's direction. Michael's appetite disappeared. He put money on the table, left without finishing his meal, and walked quickly back to his truck. His hands were shaking as he unlocked the door and climbed into the cab. The man didn't follow, didn't get up, didn't move. But Michael had gotten the message. Someone knew. Someone knew he'd taken the photograph. Someone knew what he'd seen. And someone wanted him to know that he was being watched. Michael started his truck and drove out of Denver that afternoon, even though he wasn't scheduled for another pickup until the following day. He called his dispatcher from a payphone in Wyoming, said he was dealing with a family emergency, and asked for a week off. The dispatcher, a woman named Helen who'd been working the same job for 15 years, didn't ask questions. She just said, "Okay, take care of yourself, call when you're ready to come back." Michael drove to his apartment in Los Angeles, locked the door and sat in his living room for a long time, trying to figure out what to do. The photograph was still in the envelope, still hidden in a drawer. He hadn't shown it to anyone. He hadn't made copies. He hadn't told anyone about the convoy or what he'd seen, but they knew anyway, which meant they'd been watching the highway that day, which meant they had cameras, surveillance, systems in place to track who was on that stretch of road when the convoy passed through, which meant the convoy hadn't been routine. It had been something else, something important enough to monitor, something sensitive enough that anyone who saw it became a person of interest. Michael opened the drawer, took out the envelope and looked at the photograph one more time. That smooth circular shape, that impossible design, that thing that shouldn't exist. He thought about destroying it, burning it, tearing it into pieces and flushing it down the toilet. But he didn't, because destroying the photograph wouldn't make the men in suits go away. It wouldn't erase what he'd seen. It wouldn't change the fact that he was now part of something he didn't understand and couldn't control. So he put the photograph back in the envelope, put the envelope back in the drawer and waited. Waited for a knock on the door, waited for a phone call, waited for whatever came next. 3 days passed, nothing happened. On the 4th day, Michael went back to work. Chapter 4. The Patterns in the Desert. Michael returned to his normal routes, hauling freight between California and the mountain states, trying to act like everything was fine. But he started noticing things. Small things. Details he might have overlooked before. The frequency of military convoys on Highway 15 had increased. Or maybe Michael was just paying more attention. Either way, he saw them more often now. Black SUVs, flatbed trucks, covered loads moving through the desert with armed escorts. He saw them at night, which was expected, but he also saw them during the day, which was unusual, and he started recognizing patterns. The convoys always travelled in the same formation. 2 escort vehicles, 1 lead and 1 trailing, with a cargo truck in the middle. They always moved at the same speed, 55 to 60 miles per hour, below the flow of normal traffic. They always maintained the same spacing between vehicles, precise to the point of being mechanical, and they were always on the same stretches of highway, between Barstow and the Nevada border. between Las Vegas and the Tonopah area, between Interstate 15 and the secondary routes that led toward restricted military zones. Michael started keeping a log. He bought a small notebook and began recording every convoy he saw. Date, time, location, number of vehicles, type of cargo when visible. He didn't know why he was doing it. Maybe it made him feel like he had some control over the situation. Maybe it was a way of documenting what was happening in case something went wrong. Or maybe he just needed to understand. Within 3 weeks, Michael had logged 14 convoys. Most of them were unremarkable. Standard military, transports, equipment that looked conventional, even if he couldn't identify the specific hardware. But 3 of the convoys were different. October 11th, 1994, Highway 15, northbound, approximately 40 miles south of Las Vegas. Time, 11:15 at night. Convoy consisting of 2 Suburbans and 1 flatbed. Cargo covered with dark tarp, circular profile visible underneath. Diameter estimated at 15 to 20 feet. October 23rd, 1994. Highway 375, southbound near Hico, Nevada. Time, 2:30 in the afternoon. Convoy consisting of 3 Suburbans and 1 flatbed. Cargo covered with silver tarp. Shape indeterminate, but unusual profile. Not angular like conventional aerospace hardware. November 2nd, 1994. Highway 95, northbound near Beatty, Nevada. Time, 6:45 in the morning. Convoy consisting of 2 Suburbans, 1 flatbed, and an additional white van. Cargo covered with brown, tarp, circular object visible at the edges where tarp had shifted. Estimated diameter 20 to 25 feet. 3 sightings, 3 different dates, 3 different locations, but the cargo looked similar every time. Michael started asking around, quietly, carefully. He talked to other truckers at rest stops and diners, asked if they'd seen anything unusual on the desert highways. Most of them said no. Some of them looked at him like he was crazy. A few of them said they'd seen military convoys, but nothing out of the ordinary. But one driver, an older man named Robert Keane, who'd been running desert routes since the 1970s, pulled Michael aside at a truck stop in Tonopah and told him something interesting. "You're not the first person to notice," Robert said quietly. "I've been seeing those convoys for 20 years. Same formation, same cargo profile, same roads." "What are they moving?" Michael asked. Robert shrugged. "No one knows for sure, but I'll tell you what I think. I think they're moving things that didn't come from Lockheed or Boeing or Northrop. I think they're moving things that came from somewhere else." "Somewhere else?" Michael repeated. Robert looked at him for a long moment. "You seem like a smart guy, so I'm going to give you some advice. Whatever you saw, whatever you think you saw, forget about it. Don't take pictures, don't ask questions, don't try to figure it out, because the people moving that cargo don't want anyone figuring it out, and they have ways of making sure you don't." "What kind of ways?" Michael asked. Robert didn't answer. He just clapped Michael on the shoulder, walked back to his truck, and drove away. Michael never saw him again. Chapter 5. The Interview That Never Happened. In December of 1994, Michael received a phone call. He was at his apartment in Los Angeles going through his mail when the phone rang. He picked it up, expecting a call from his dispatcher or maybe a sister in Phoenix. Instead, a man's voice, calm and professional, said, "Is this Michael Brennan?" "Yes," Michael said slowly. "Who's this?" "My name is Agent Patterson. I'm with the Department of Defense, Office of Special Investigations. I'd like to speak with you about an incident that occurred on Highway 15 in September. Would you be available to meet?" Michael's stomach dropped. "What incident?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'd prefer to discuss this in person," Patterson said. "There's a diner on Wilshire Boulevard near MacArthur Park. Could you meet me there tomorrow at 10 in the morning?" "I'm scheduled for a run tomorrow," Michael said. "Reschedule it," Patterson said. It wasn't a request. Michael met Patterson at the diner the next morning. Patterson was in his late 40s, dressed in a grey suit, with the kind of face that gave nothing away. He was already sitting in a booth when Michael arrived, drinking coffee, a manila folder on the table in front of him. Michael slid into the booth across from him. "Thank you for coming," Patterson said. He didn't smile. "I'll get right to the point. On September 20th, you were driving on Highway 15 between Barstow and the Nevada border. You passed a military convoy transporting classified equipment. We have reason to believe you photographed that convoy." Michael's mouth went dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." Patterson opened the manila folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was a surveillance photo, black and white, grainy, but unmistakable. It showed Michael's truck, seen from above, passing the convoy. In the photo, you could see Michael's arm extended toward the passenger side window holding something small, a camera. "Satellite imagery," Patterson said calmly. "We monitor all traffic on certain highways when sensitive transports are in progress. Standard security protocol." Michael stared at the photo. "I didn't see anything." "You took 3 photographs," Patterson said. "I need you to turn them over." "I don't have any photographs," Michael said. Patterson studied him for a moment. "Mr. Brennan, let me be very clear about something. What you saw on that truck is classified at a level that requires special access clearance. The fact that you photographed it puts you in violation of federal law. I can have your commercial driver's license revoked. I can have you prosecuted under the Espionage Act, or we can handle this quietly. You give me the photographs, you sign a non-disclosure agreement, and this conversation never happened." Michael didn't say anything. Patterson continued. "You're not in trouble. You didn't do anything wrong intentionally. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, but I need those photographs." "And if I don't have them?" Michael asked. Patterson's expression didn't change. Then things get complicated. They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally Michael said, "I need to think about it." Patterson slid a business card across the table. "You have 48 hours. After that I file a report and this stops being a conversation." Michael took the card and left the diner. He drove back to his apartment, his mind racing. They had satellite footage. They knew he'd taken photographs. They knew exactly where he'd been and what he'd seen. And now they wanted the evidence destroyed, which meant the evidence mattered, which meant whatever was on that truck was important enough to threaten criminal prosecution over a photograph taken from a moving vehicle on a public highway. Michael went to his apartment, retrieved the envelope from the drawer, and looked at the photograph one more time. Then he did something that would change the trajectory of his entire life. He went to a Kinko's copy shop, made 3 copies of the photograph, and mailed them to 3 different addresses. One to his sister in Phoenix, with a note telling her to keep it safe and not ask questions. One to a post office box he rented under a false name. And one to a journalist he'd read about in UFO magazine, a man named Glenn Harper, who had been investigating classified aerospace programs for years. Then he took the original photograph, put it back in the envelope and waited. 2 days later, he called Patterson's number. They met at the same diner. Michael slid the envelope across the table. Patterson opened it, examined the photograph, and nodded. "Thank you for your cooperation," he said. He produced a document several pages long and placed it in front of Michael. "This is a non-disclosure agreement. It states that you will not discuss what you saw, will not attempt to photograph or document any future military transports, and will not speak to media or researchers about this incident. Sign it, and we're done." Michael signed. He had no choice. But as he walked out of that diner, he knew one thing for certain. The photograph he'd given Patterson was the original, but the copies were out there, safely hidden, beyond the government's reach, and one of them was on its way to someone who would know what to do with it. Chapter 6. Glenn Harper and the Underground Network. Glenn Harper received the envelope 3 weeks later. It arrived at his office address in Phoenix, Arizona, forwarded from a now-defunct post office box he'd maintained years earlier for anonymous tips. The envelope had no return address, no note, just a single photograph and a handwritten date, September 20th, 1994. Glenn had been investigating classified military programs since the mid-1980s. He'd started as a freelance journalist covering aviation and defense, but over the years his focus had narrowed to a specific niche, unexplained aerospace phenomena, and the government programs designed to study them. He'd written articles about the F-117 before it was publicly acknowledged. He'd broken stories about black budget programs, classified test ranges and contractor facilities that operated outside normal oversight. His work had appeared in Aviation Week, Popular Mechanics, and a handful of specialised publications that catered to readers interested in the intersection of aerospace technology and government secrecy. But his most important work, the research that consumed most of his time, never made it into mainstream publications, because Glenn Harper believed, based on years of documentation, witness testimony, and leaked materials, that the United States government was in possession of technology that did not originate on Earth. He ran a small newsletter called the Black Vault Report, distributed by mail to a few hundred subscribers who paid $20 a year for quarterly updates on classified programs, unusual sightings, and leaked documents that Glenn had acquired through Freedom of Information Act requests and anonymous sources. The photograph that Michael Brennan mailed him was unlike anything Glenn had received before. It showed a military convoy transporting something circular, smooth, and completely inconsistent with known aerospace profiles. The image was grainy, shot through a windshield at distance, but Glenn had been analysing this kind of imagery for years. He knew how to enhance it, how to extract details, how to cross-reference it with other reports, and within an hour of examining the photograph, Glenn knew it was significant. He made copies. He scanned the image and began digital enhancement using software designed for analysing surveillance photography. He cross-referenced the truck's visible features with commercial vehicle databases to confirm it was a standard Peterbilt model, which suggested civilian contract transport rather than direct military operation. Then he started making phone calls. Glenn maintained a network of contacts across the southwest. Retired military personnel, former aerospace engineers, truckers, security contractors, and civilian employees who worked at or near classified facilities. People who saw things, heard things, knew things they weren't supposed to know. Over the next 2 weeks, Glenn contacted 17 people. 14 of them had nothing useful to contribute, but 3 of them told him something interesting. A retired Air Force logistics officer who had worked at Nellis in the early 90s confirmed that circular objects, described in internal documents as recovered materials, had been transported through Nevada during that time period. The officer wouldn't provide specifics, but he confirmed that the transports used civilian contractors to reduce visibility. A former security guard who had worked at a facility near Tonopah described seeing similar convoys in the late 80s and early 90s. He said the objects were always covered, always moved at night or during low traffic periods, and always escorted by personnel who carried enough firepower to suggest the cargo was extraordinarily valuable. And a civilian aircraft mechanic who had worked at Groom Lake in the 70s told Glenn something that tied everything together. "They've been moving those things since at least the 1950s, the mechanic said during a phone call. "I saw one in 76. Smooth, circular, no seams. It was being transported from a storage facility to a testing hangar. The guys handling it wore full hazmat suits, like they were worried about radiation or contamination. I asked what it was. They told me it was above my clearance level. But here's the thing. They also told me it wasn't ours." "Meaning what?" Glenn asked. "Meaning we didn't build it," the mechanic said. "Meaning someone else did." Glenn published his findings in the next issue of the Black Vault Report, released in February of 1995. The article included the photograph, enhanced to show as much detail as possible. It included testimony from the 3 sources, anonymized to protect their identities. It included analysis of the object's dimensions, its apparent lack of conventional aerospace features, and its similarity to other reported sightings over the previous decades. Glenn titled the article, "The Cargo That Can't Fly: Evidence of Non-Conventional Aerospace Transports in Nevada." The response was immediate. Within a week, Glenn received phone calls from 3 government agencies: the Department of Defense, the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and an agency that wouldn't identify itself, but whose representative made it very clear that Glenn was jeopardizing national security by publishing classified information. Glenn told all of them the same thing. He was a journalist exercising his First Amendment rights. The photograph had been provided by an anonymous source, and unless they could prove the information was classified under a legal framework that applied to civilian publications, he had every right to publish it. The calls stopped after that, but Glenn started noticing other things. His mail was being opened and resealed. Poorly. The government wasn't even trying to hide it. His phone line developed a faint clicking sound during calls, the kind of audio artifact that suggests monitoring equipment. And on 2 occasions, he noticed vehicles parked outside his office for extended periods. Different vehicles each time, but always occupied by men in suits who watched his building and didn't try to hide the fact that they were watching. Glenn didn't stop. He kept investigating, kept publishing, kept collecting witness testimony and leaked documents and photographs that suggested the government was hiding something far bigger than advanced aerospace programs. But he also knew that he'd crossed a line, that he'd published something the government desperately wanted to keep quiet, and that there would be consequences. Chapter 7. The facilities no one admits exist. While Glenn Harper was publishing his research, another investigation was quietly unfolding. A congressional staffer named Elizabeth Cortez, working for a representative on the House Armed Services Committee, had started noticing anomalies in the Defense Department's budget submissions. Elizabeth's job was to review line items in the black budget, the classified portion of defense spending that funds programs too sensitive for public disclosure. It was tedious work, sifting through heavily redacted documents, trying to make sense of expenditures that were deliberately obscured. But Elizabeth was good at her job. She had a background in accounting and an eye for patterns, and in early 1995 she noticed something strange. There were recurring allocations to a program designated only as Project Sentinel. The amounts varied, but they were substantial, sometimes tens of millions of dollars per quarter. The program fell under the Air Force's Special Access Program category, which meant it required additional clearances beyond standard top-secret classification. But here's what caught Elizabeth's attention. The expenditures didn't correlate with any known aircraft program. They weren't tied to bomber development, fighter programs, or satellite systems. The funding patterns didn't match research and development cycles. They didn't match procurement schedules, they matched something else. Logistics, transportation, facility maintenance, security. As if the program wasn't developing new technology, but managing existing technology that required constant oversight. Elizabeth started digging. She requested additional documentation through official channels. Most of her requests were denied due to classification restrictions, but occasionally a document would slip through with minimal redaction, and Elizabeth would piece together fragments of information. Project Sentinel involved multiple facilities. At least one was located in Nevada. Another appeared to be in New Mexico. A third was referenced in documents related to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, which had a long history of handling unusual materials recovered from crash sites. The program involved civilian contractors. Lockheed was mentioned several times, as was a smaller company called EG&G, which specialised in providing technical services to government agencies, and the program involved transportation, recurring costs for convoy security, vehicle maintenance, route planning, and specimen containment protocols. Specimen. That word appeared in 3 different documents, never explained, never defined, just specimen containment and specimen transport and specimen analysis. Elizabeth brought her findings to her boss, Representative Thomas Alderman, a moderate Democrat from Oregon who had served on the Armed Services Committee for 12 years. Alderman reviewed the documents Elizabeth had compiled and then asked her a question. What do you think this is? Elizabeth chose her words carefully. I think we're funding a program to study something we didn't build, something that requires ongoing analysis, secure storage, and occasional transport between facilities. And I think the classification level is so high because disclosing the program would require acknowledging that whatever we're studying didn't come from a conventional source. Alderman stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Write up a summary. Don't speculate, just the facts. I'll forward it to the committee chair and request a classified briefing." Elizabeth wrote the summary. Alderman submitted the request. 3 weeks later, Alderman received a response from the Department of Defense. The response stated that Project Sentinel was a properly classified program operating within legal and oversight frameworks. It stated that no briefing could be provided to the Armed Services Committee due to compartmentalisation restrictions, and it stated that further inquiry would be inappropriate and potentially damaging to national security interests. Translation: stop asking questions. Alderman was furious. He drafted a letter to the Secretary of Defense demanding transparency and accountability. He argued that Congress had a constitutional obligation to provide oversight of military spending, and that blanket classification couldn't be used to circumvent that oversight. The letter was sent. It was never answered. 2 months later, Alderman announced he wouldn't be seeking re-election. He cited personal reasons, family concerns, a desire to spend more time in Oregon. But Elizabeth knew the truth. He'd been warned, quietly, privately, by people who made it very clear that pushing further would end his political career and possibly put him in legal jeopardy. Elizabeth left her position shortly after Alderman's announcement. She went into private practice working as a consultant for defence contractors and never spoke publicly about Project Sentinel. But she kept copies of the documents she'd compiled, filed away in a safe deposit box just in case, because she understood something that most people didn't. The government wasn't hiding advanced technology. It was hiding the source of that technology. And as long as that source remained classified, as long as the facilities remained unacknowledged, as long as the transports continued moving through the desert under cover of darkness and bureaucratic obfuscation, the truth would stay buried, unless someone forced it into the light. Chapter 8. What the mechanics knew. While politicians and journalists circled around classified programs from the outside, there were people on the inside who knew exactly what was being moved. They just weren't allowed to talk about it. James Whitmore was one of those people. He'd worked as an aircraft mechanic at Groom Lake, Area 51, from 1968 to 1983. 15 years of working on some of the most advanced aerospace programs in American history. He'd maintained U-2 spy planes. He'd worked on early stealth prototypes. He'd been part of the ground crew that supported testing of classified reconnaissance systems that still haven't been fully disclosed. But the work that stuck with him, the work that he thought about decades later when he was retired and living in a small town in New Mexico, wasn't the work on conventional aircraft. It was the work on things that weren't conventional at all. In 1976, James was assigned to a special detail. He and 4 other mechanics were pulled from their regular duties and told they'd be supporting a classified program in Hangar 18, a facility at the north end of Groom Lake that most personnel weren't allowed to enter. They were told the work would require additional security clearances. They were told they'd be handling materials that were beyond standard classification protocols. They were told that discussing the work, even with other cleared personnel, would result in immediate termination and possible criminal prosecution. They signed the paperwork. They received the clearances. And then they went to work. Hangar 18 was different from the other facilities at Groom Lake. It was older, built in the early 50s, with thick concrete walls and a ventilation system that suggested the interior environment needed to be carefully controlled. The hangar could be sealed completely, creating an airtight space that could be pressurized or depressurized as needed. Inside the hangar were 3 objects. All 3 were circular. All 3 were smooth, with no visible seams or fasteners. All 3 ranged between 15 and 25 feet in diameter. They sat on reinforced platforms, surrounded by diagnostic equipment, monitoring systems and testing apparatus that James didn't fully understand. Engineers in lab coats moved between the objects, taking measurements, recording data, occasionally using specialized tools to interact with the surfaces. James and his team weren't told what the objects were. They weren't told where they came from. They were simply told to maintain the equipment used to study them and to ensure the hangar's environmental systems remained operational. But over the course of 6 months, working in that hangar, James observed things that didn't make sense. The objects didn't corrode. They showed no signs of weathering, oxidation, or material degradation despite being exposed to various environmental conditions during testing. The surfaces were perfectly smooth at a microscopic level. James once watched an engineer examine one of the objects under high magnification imaging, and the surface showed no tooling marks, no grained structure, no evidence of conventional manufacturing. The objects were lighter than they should have been. James helped move one of them using a specialised lift system, and despite its size, the object weighed maybe a few £100, far less than a comparable volume of metal or composite material, and strangest of all, the objects occasionally exhibited properties that James couldn't explain. Faint electromagnetic fields that appeared and disappeared without apparent cause, temperature variations that didn't correspond to ambient conditions. On one occasion, James saw an object emit a brief pulse of light, a soft blue glow that lasted maybe 2 seconds before fading. The engineers recorded everything. They seemed excited, energized, like they were on the verge of understanding something profound. But they never explained any of it to James or his team. After 6 months, the assignment ended. James was reassigned to conventional aircraft maintenance. The hangar was sealed, and he was told, once again, that discussing what he had seen would result in severe consequences. James kept quiet for 40 years, but in 2016, as he was approaching 80 years old and dealing with health issues that made him think about legacy and truth, he reached out to a researcher who had been documenting testimony from former Area 51 employees. He told his story. He described the objects, the hangar, the tests. He described the way the engineers had treated the objects, not like prototypes or test articles, but like artifacts, like things they were trying to understand rather than things they had built. The researcher asked James where he thought the objects had come from. James paused for a long time before answering. "I don't think they came from Earth," he said finally. "I think we found them, or they were given to us, or they crashed and we recovered them, but I don't think we built them. Because if we had, the engineers wouldn't have been so surprised by what they were seeing. They would have known, but they didn't. They were learning, and you don't learn from something you designed." The researcher published James's testimony in a small online journal dedicated to aerospace history and classified programs. The article received minimal attention. Most readers dismissed it as the misremembered stories of an elderly man whose memory had been distorted by time and popular culture. But a few readers noticed something important. James's description of the objects matched the object in the photograph that Glenn Harper had published 20 years earlier. Smooth, circular, seamless, wrong. And when those readers cross-referenced James's timeline, 1976, with other documented sightings, they found something else. Reports of circular objects being transported through Nevada on trucks had been recorded as early as the 1950s. The reports continued through the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s. Decades of transports, decades of sightings, decades of objects that looked the same, behaved the same, and were handled the same way, as if there were multiple objects, as if whatever was being studied at Groom Lake and other facilities wasn't a single recovery. It was an ongoing program, a systematic effort to collect, transport and analyse technology from somewhere else. And the trucks rolling through the desert weren't anomalies, they were standard procedure. Chapter 9. The Conversation. Michael never had Michael Brennan try to go back to his normal life. He kept driving his routes. He kept avoiding the desert highways where he'd seen the convoy. He kept his head down and his mouth shut. But in May of 1995, 8 months after he'd photographed the convoy, and 4 months after Glenn Harper had published the image in the Black Vault report, Michael received a phone call that changed everything. It was late at night. Michael was in his apartment watching television when the phone rang. He picked it up, expecting it to be his dispatcher, or maybe a wrong number. Instead, a woman's voice said, "Is this Michael Brennan, the truck driver who photographed the convoy on Highway 15? Michael's first instinct was to hang up, but something in the woman's voice, urgency, fear, made him hesitate. "Who is this?" he asked. "My name is Catherine Mills," the woman said. "I'm a physicist. I worked on a classified program in the 1980s. I saw your photograph in Glenn Harper's newsletter. I need to talk to you." "I don't know what you're talking about," Michael said. "Yes, you do," Catherine said. "And I know you're scared. I know they interviewed you. I know they made you sign a non-disclosure agreement. But I need you to listen to me. What you saw on that truck wasn't a prototype. It wasn't experimental technology. It was recovered material. And there are more of them. More objects. More facilities. More programs. And the government has been lying about it for 50 years. Michael's hand tightened on the phone. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm dying," Catherine said bluntly. "I have stage 4 lung cancer, 6 months, maybe less. And before I die, I want someone to know the truth. I want someone who's seen what I've seen to understand what's really happening." Michael sat down on his couch. "I'm listening." Catherine talked for over an hour. She described her work at Los Alamos National Laboratory in the mid-1980s, where she'd been part of a team analysing unusual materials recovered from various sites over the previous decades. She described materials with properties that didn't match any known elements or alloys. She described testing that revealed crystalline structures inconsistent with terrestrial geology. She described energy signatures that suggested the materials had been exposed to processes or environments that didn't exist on Earth. She described being shown objects, not fragments, but intact objects that were circular, smooth, and completely inexplicable from an engineering standpoint. "They told us we were reverse engineering enemy technology," Catherine said. "That's what they told everyone. Soviet materials, Chinese prototypes, captured foreign equipment. But that was a lie, because the testing showed that these materials were older than human civilization. Carbon dating put some of them at thousands of years old. Others didn't have any radioactive isotopes that would allow for conventional dating. It was like they existed outside normal physics." "Where did they come from?" Michael asked. "Some were recovered from crash sites," Catherine said. "Some were found buried. One was recovered from the ocean floor off the coast of California. But here's the thing. They weren't isolated incidents. We had dozens of these objects. Different sizes, different configurations, but all showing the same characteristics. All made from materials we couldn't replicate. All exhibiting properties we couldn't explain." "What happened to the program?" Michael asked. "It's still running," Catherine said. "They just compartmentalized it further, created more barriers between research teams so no one could see the full picture. They moved operations to different facilities, changed the program names, buried it under layers of classification, but the work continues. They're still studying these objects, still trying to understand how they work, still trying to figure out where they came from and why there are so many of them." "Why are you telling me this?" Michael asked again. "Because you have evidence," Catherine said. "You have a photograph, and that photograph shows one of these objects being transported in broad daylight, which means they're still moving them, which means the program is active, which means someone needs to document this before it's too late." "The government will never acknowledge any of this," Michael said. "I know," Catherine said, "but that doesn't mean we should stop trying. It doesn't mean we should let them bury the truth forever." They talked for another 30 minutes. Catherine gave Michael contact information for 2 other former researchers who had worked on similar programs and who might be willing to talk. She told him to be careful, to assume his communications were monitored, to trust no one in an official capacity. And then she said goodbye. Michael never heard from her again. He tried calling the number she'd given him a week later. It was disconnected. He tried searching for her name in public records and obituaries. He found nothing. Catherine Mills, if that was even her real name, had vanished. But her story stayed with Michael, and it made him realise that what he'd photographed on Highway 15 wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something much larger, something that had been happening for decades, something the government was determined to keep hidden, no matter the cost. Chapter 10. The Truck That Never Stopped. In the years that followed, Michael Brennan kept driving. He never photographed another convoy. He never spoke publicly about what he'd seen. He honoured the non-disclosure agreement he'd signed, at least in the technical sense. But he kept his eyes open, and he kept seeing them. The convoys, the covered loads, the smooth circular shapes under tarps that fluttered in the desert wind. He saw them in 1996, in 1997, in 1998. Different routes, different times, but always the same formation, always the same cargo profile, always moving through the desert, slow and deliberate, like they were carrying something that couldn't be rushed. Michael retired from trucking in 2003. He sold his rig, moved to a small town in Arizona, and tried to forget about the highways and the convoys and the photograph that had changed his life. But he couldn't forget, because every time he drove through the desert, Every time he saw a military vehicle or a covered load or a black SUV with tinted windows, he remembered. He remembered the shape under the tarp, the smooth, impossible surface, the way it had sat on the flatbed like it belonged there, like it had been designed for exactly that purpose. And he remembered Catherine Mills's voice on the phone telling him that what he'd seen was part of a program that had been running for 50 years, a program that was still running, that would probably keep running for another 50 years, hidden under layers of classification and bureaucratic obfuscation and official denials. In 2007, Michael was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. The tremors were mild at first, but they progressed over the following years. By 2012, he needed a cane to walk. By 2015, he was mostly confined to his home. It was during those final years, as his health declined, that Michael decided to do something he'd been avoiding for 2 decades. He wrote it all down. Everything he remembered about the convoy, about the photograph, about Agent Patterson and the non-disclosure agreement, about Catherine Mills and her phone call, about the other sightings, the patterns, the routes. He wrote it in longhand, filling 3 notebooks with his increasingly shaky handwriting. And when he was finished, he mailed the notebooks to Glenn Harper, who was still publishing the Black Vault report from an office in Phoenix. Glenn received the notebooks in March of 2016. He read them cover to cover, and then he published excerpts in a special edition of his newsletter, along with the original photograph from 1994. The edition was titled "The Cargo That Couldn't Fly 20 Years Later." It included Michael's testimony. It included additional witness reports Glenn had collected over the years. It included analysis from researchers who'd been studying these transports independently. And it included one final detail that tied everything together. In December of 2015, a video had been uploaded to YouTube by a motorist driving through Nevada. The video was shaky, filmed on a phone through a car window, but it clearly showed a convoy, 2 SUVs and a flatbed truck, transporting something circular under a dark tarp. The convoy was travelling on Highway 375, the extraterrestrial highway. The date stamp on the video was December 18th, 2015, 21 years after Michael Brennan had photographed a nearly identical convoy on Highway 15. Same formation, same cargo profile, same slow, deliberate movement, as if nothing had changed, as if the program was still running, just as it had been for decades, just as it probably would continue running for decades more. Michael Brennan passed away in June of 2017. The official cause of death was complications from Parkinson's disease. He was 68 years old. His obituary made no mention of convoys, photographs, or classified programs. But among the people who had followed his story, who had read his testimony, who believed that the government was hiding something profound in the desert, Michael was remembered as the man who saw something he wasn't supposed to see, and who made sure the evidence survived. Epilogue. The highway still remembers. The convoy still moved through the desert. If you drive Highway 15 at the right time, if you're paying attention, if you know what to look for, you might see them. Black SUVs, flatbed trucks, covered loads that sit too perfectly balanced, that move too carefully, that are escorted too seriously to be routine freight. Sometimes the sightings end up online, a video on YouTube, a photo on Reddit, a forum post describing something unusual seen on a lonely stretch of highway. Most of the time these sightings are dismissed, explained away as conventional military transports, ignored, forgotten, because that's what the system relies on. Not perfect secrecy, not absolute control, just enough doubt, just enough plausible deniability, just enough official silence to make people second-guess what they've seen. The photograph Michael Brennan took in September of 1994 still exists. It's been reproduced thousands of times, analysed by researchers, referenced in documentaries, studied by aerospace engineers and intelligence analysts and conspiracy theorists. Some people say it shows a prototype aircraft component. Some say it's an experimental propulsion system. Some say it's debris from a foreign satellite. And some people say it's proof that the government has been in possession of non-human technology for decades. That it's been studying that technology, transporting it, hiding it, and that the trucks rolling through the desert aren't moving prototypes. They're moving evidence. Evidence of something that would change everything we think we know about our place in the universe. Evidence that can't be disclosed without destroying the carefully constructed narrative that we're alone. So the trucks keep moving, the convoys keep running their routes, the programs keep operating in the shadows, and the people who see something, the truckers, the travellers, the witnesses who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, are managed, silenced, or dismissed. Because the most advanced thing about what Michael Brennan saw that day wasn't the object on the flatbed. It was the system designed to make sure no one believed it. The system that's been running since the 1940s, since Roswell, since the first recovery, since the moment the government realised that what they'd found couldn't be explained. Michael Brennan saw through that system for exactly 11 seconds, long enough to raise a camera, long enough to press the shutter, long enough to capture proof, and that proof still exists, hidden in archives, published in newsletters, shared on forums, stored in safe deposit boxes and old filing cabinets, and the memories of people who know that what they saw was real. The highway doesn't forget, and neither do the people who drive it. Whatever was on that truck in September of 1994 didn't need to hide, it just needed to arrive. And it did, just like all the others before it, just like all the others that will follow, moving through the desert, one slow mile at a time, under tarps that sometimes slip, watched by people who sometimes notice, people like Michael Brennan, people who understand that some things you see, you're never supposed to talk about. But sometimes you talk anyway, because the truth matters more than the consequences, and some secrets are too important to stay buried forever. Hey everyone, welcome back to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content and want to help this video reach more people, go ahead and use your hype points. It really makes a difference and helps us keep bringing you these deep dives into the unknown. Also, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's wild to know some of you are listening at 3 in the morning while others are on your lunch break halfway across the globe. This isn't just another story about little green men and flying saucers. This is about the freight that never delivered, the trucker who saw too much, and the desert that keeps its secrets better than any government ever could. So get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let's talk about what really happens on the roads leading to the most classified military installation in American history. Area 51, the freight that never delivered the desert frequency. There's a stretch of highway in Nevada that doesn't appear on most GPS systems the way it should. Highway 375 runs through the kind of emptiness that makes you question whether civilization was ever really here at all. They call it the extraterrestrial highway now, a nickname that started as a joke and became official in 1996 when the state put up signs with little UFO symbols. But the truckers who've driven it for decades, the ones who haul freight through the night when the desert temperature drops and the stars spread out like broken glass across black velvet, they call it something else. They call it the frequency. Not because of radio signals, though those are strange enough out here. They call it that because of the hum, the feeling, the sense that something underneath the sand is listening, waiting, broadcasting on a wavelength that human ears weren't designed to detect, but human instincts recognise all the same. Jack Reeves knew that feeling better than most. He was 48 years old in the summer of 2013, a man whose face had been weathered by 2 decades of long-haul trucking through the American Southwest. He had the kind of face that looked older in dim light and younger in the sun, creased around the eyes from squinting at endless roads, stubbled because shaving in truck stop bathrooms was more trouble than it was worth. His hands were thick and calloused, wrapped around a steering wheel more often than not, and he had a voice that carried the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who spent most of his time alone. Jack worked as an independent contractor for a subsidiary of EG&G Special Projects, a company whose name appeared on very few documents and whose employees signed non-disclosure agreements as thick as phone books. EG&G had serviced Groom Lake Airstrip since the early 80s, back when the base officially didn't exist and the government maintained that the lights people saw in the desert sky were swamp gas or weather balloons, or the planet Venus seen through atmospheric distortion. Jack's job was simple, at least on paper. He picked up freight from Nellis Air Force Base outside Las Vegas, signed for it without asking questions, and delivered it to coordinates that changed depending on the week. Sometimes it was Tonopah Test Range, sometimes it was isolated hangars near Mercury, Nevada. And sometimes, though not often, it was the place that had no name on any map, the place where the roads ended and the fences began, and the signs warned that photography was prohibited and use of deadly force was authorized. He'd been driving these routes since 2008, and in all that time, he'd learned 3 rules that kept him employed and alive. Rule 1, never open the cargo. Rule 2, never talk about the cargo. Rule 3, never ever stop the truck between the checkpoint and the delivery zone. But rules, Jack had learned, were made by people who'd never driven through the desert at 3 a.m. listening to Art Bell reruns on AM radio, hearing the stories about whistleblowers and black projects and things that move through the sky in ways that physics professors said were impossible. Rules were made by people who'd never felt the hum. The night it all changed started like any other. Act 1. The Contract. August 26th, 2013. The date mattered because 3 months earlier, the CIA had done something unprecedented. They'd released documents, heavily redacted but official, that finally acknowledged what conspiracy theorists had been saying for decades. Area 51 existed. It was real. It had a location, coordinates that placed it at Groom Lake in the Nevada desert, and it had been used since 1955 for classified aircraft testing. The U-2 spy plane had been born there, assembled in secret and tested in skies that civilians were forbidden from entering. Later came the A-12 ox cart, sleek and black and capable of speeds that seemed like science fiction. Then the SR-71 Blackbird, a plane so advanced that its titanium skin would expand from heat friction at high altitude, a plane that could outrun missiles by simply accelerating. And in the 80s, the F-117 Nighthawk, the first true stealth aircraft, a geometric impossibility that looked like it had been folded from paper by aliens who'd never seen a bird. All of it had happened at Groom Lake. All of it had been hidden behind denials and cover stories, and men with clipboards who wrote classified across every piece of paper that left the base. But in June of 2013, the CIA had finally admitted it. They released a report acknowledging the U-2 program, mentioning Area 51 by name, even including a map with the base's location marked in a small black square. Conspiracy theorists celebrated, skeptics shrugged, and the government said in effect, yes, it exists. Yes, we test secret aircraft there. No, there are no aliens. Jack had been listening to the news reports while driving a load of industrial refrigeration units to Creech Air Force Base. He'd laughed, a short bark of amusement that echoed in his empty cab. Of course, they'd admit to the stuff that was already obsolete. The U-2 had been declassified for years. The Blackbird was in museums. The public could handle hearing about planes from the 60s and 70s. What they wouldn't hear about were the things being tested now, the projects with budget allocations buried in documents labelled miscellaneous procurement and advanced aerospace studies. 2 months after the CIA's admission, Jack got a call from his dispatcher. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, female, not his usual contact. She told him there was a priority hall available, high security clearance required, double the normal pay rate. Pick up at Nellis, delivery to Site U-97. The cargo was listed as avionics hardware, sensitive equipment, standard protocol. Jack had done dozens of hauls like this. He said yes before she had finished explaining the terms. He picked up the truck on a Thursday evening, the sun already sinking behind the Spring Mountains, turning the desert into shades of copper and rust. The facility at Nellis was a warren of warehouses and hangars, most of them identical, all of them anonymous. A forklift operator loaded a single container into his trailer, a silver box about the size of a small car stencilled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to Jack. He signed the electronic manifest noting that the destination field was blank except for the site designation, U-97. The paperwork also included a non-disclosure agreement. Jack had signed hundreds of them. This one was different. The logo at the top wasn't EG&G. It was Ecom/URS Federal Services, a company he'd heard of in passing, but never worked with directly. They were contractors, the kind that handled infrastructure for classified sites, the kind whose employees knew how to keep their mouths shut because talking meant prison time under the Espionage Act. He signed. He climbed into his cab. He started the engine and rolled out of Nellis as the first stars appeared overhead. The route took him north on Highway 95, away from the neon glow of Las Vegas, away from the last outpost of civilization. The road was empty. It always was at this hour. Jack settled into the rhythm of driving, hands loose on the wheel, eyes scanning the horizon for the reflective glint of deer or the sudden appearance of jackrabbits. He reached over and clicked on his radio, spinning the dial until he caught the familiar crackle of AM frequency. It was a rebroadcast, one of the classic Art Bell episodes from the late 90s. Jack had heard it before, but it never got old. The voice was calm, hypnotic, the kind of voice that made the impossible sound reasonable. Tonight's episode was a replay from September 11th, 1997, the night a man called in claiming to be a former Area 51 employee. His voice was frantic, panicked, breaking up with static as he described extraterrestrial entities and interdimensional beings and disasters that would wipe out major population centres. Then the line had gone dead. The station's satellite feed had cut out, and for the next 30 minutes Coast to Coast AM had been off the air. Jack had always assumed it was a hoax, a performance piece by someone with too much imagination and access to a phone. But listening to it again, alone in his cab with the cargo rattling faintly behind him, he felt the hairs on his arms stand up. The caller's voice had sounded genuinely terrified, and the way the broadcast had been cut off, the way Art Bell himself had sounded confused and unsettled when the show came back online, it all felt too authentic to be staged. The radio crackled. The rebroadcast skipped, static washing over the caller's voice. Jack frowned and reached for the dial, but before he could adjust it, the signal died completely. Just dead air, a hiss of white noise. He glanced at his GPS. The screen was frozen, the little arrow marking his position locked in place even though he was still moving. He tapped it. Nothing. The screen flickered once, then went black. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel. He told himself it was nothing. Electronics failed out here all the time. The military ran jamming tests, radar experiments, God knew what else. His GPS would reboot in a minute. The radio would find another station. He kept driving. Act 2. History on the radio. The desert outside Jack's windshield was a study in monotone, a landscape that looked the same mile after mile. Scrub brush and sand and distant mountains that never seemed to get closer. Above him, the Milky Way was a river of light, so bright that he could see his own shadow on the dashboard. No moon tonight, just stars and silence. And then the radio came back. Not the rebroadcast, not Art Bell. This was something else. A voice that sounded like it was being played from an old reel-to-reel tape. The kind of audio quality you'd hear in a documentary from the 50s. Formal, clipped. The accent was mid-Atlantic, the kind of voice that belonged to newscasters and military spokesmen from an era when people still trusted the government. In 1955, the voice said, the Central Intelligence Agency approved the construction of a covert testing facility in the Nevada desert. The location was chosen for its remoteness, its proximity to existing military infrastructure, and its position beneath restricted airspace. The site, known internally as Groom Lake, would become the birthplace of America's most advanced reconnaissance aircraft. Jack blinked. He hadn't changed the station. He hadn't touched the dial. But somehow his radio had tuned itself to what sounded like a history lecture. The voice continued. The U-2 spy plane, designed by Lockheed's Skunk Works division, under the direction of Clarence Johnson, was first tested at Groom Lake in August of 1955. The aircraft was capable of flying at altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet, far above the range of Soviet radar and interceptor aircraft. Pilots reported that at such heights, the sky above them was not blue but black, and the curvature of the earth was visible on the horizon. Jack found himself listening despite the strangeness of it. He'd always been interested in aviation history, the engineering marvels that had emerged from the Cold War's desperate race for technological supremacy. The U-2 had been a masterpiece of design, a glider with a jet engine, so light and fragile that it could barely land without its wings scraping the runway. In 1962, the voice went on, the CIA initiated Project Oxcart, the development of a successor to the U-2. The resulting aircraft, designated a 12, was capable of speeds exceeding Mach 3 and altitudes of 90,000 feet. Its titanium fuselage could withstand temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit, the result of air friction at hypersonic velocities. Test pilots described the experience as riding a controlled explosion. The radio crackled again. The voice distorted, words stretching and compressing. Jack reached over to adjust the tuning knob, and his hand froze. The voice had changed. It was still formal, still calm, but now it was reading something else, something that sounded like a classified document. Memo to Director of Central Intelligence Alan Dulles, dated April 9th, 1958. Subject: Justification for continued secrecy, Groom Lake operations. The following rationale is provided to support ongoing denial of base existence in public discourse. First, acknowledgement of site location would compromise operational security for aircraft in development. Second, civilian speculation regarding unidentified aerial phenomena observed near restricted zones provides effective cover for test flights of experimental craft. Third, maintenance of ambiguity permits controlled disclosure on timeline determined by national security interests. Jack's throat felt dry. He wasn't sure what he was hearing, but it didn't sound like a radio program. It sounded like someone had taken actual government documents and set them to audio, reading them aloud in a voice that had no emotion, no inflection, just facts delivered in the cadence of bureaucracy. The voice skipped again, static washing over it like waves. When it came back, it was talking about the 70s. Project Have Blue, initiated in 1976, sought to develop an aircraft with minimal radar cross-section. The resulting prototype, tested at Groom Lake beginning in December of 1977, utilised faceted surfaces to deflect radar energy away from transmitting sources. Pilots reported that ground controllers could not track the aircraft visually or electronically at distances exceeding 5 miles, despite clear atmospheric conditions. Jack thought about the implications of that. A plane that was invisible to radar. A plane that looked, to any observer, like it simply wasn't there. He thought about all the UFO sightings that had been reported near Area 51 over the decades, the lights that moved in impossible ways, the craft that accelerated from a standstill to supersonic speeds without producing a sonic boom. How many of those sightings had been experimental aircraft? How many had been deliberate tests to see how people would react to something they couldn't explain? And how many, Jack wondered, had been something else entirely? The radio hissed again. This time when the voice returned, it was reading from something that sounded less like a memo and more like a testimony. Deposition of former Groom Lake contractor Richard Martinez, dated March 3rd, 1994. Mr. Martinez alleges exposure to toxic materials during waste incineration operations conducted at the facility between 1988 and 1991. Symptoms reported include respiratory distress, skin lesions, and neurological impairment. Request for compensation filed under Federal Tort Claims Act. Request denied on grounds that location of alleged exposure remains classified and cannot be confirmed for legal proceedings. Jack had heard about the lawsuits. In the mid-90s, a group of contractors and their families had sued the federal government, claiming that the Air Force had burned barrels of hazardous waste in open pits at Area 51, that the workers had been exposed to carcinogens and radioactive materials, and that several of them had died as a result. The government's response had been to invoke state secrets privilege, to say that even acknowledging the existence of the base would compromise national security. The case had been dismissed. The workers got nothing. The voice on the radio shifted again, and now it was talking about something Jack had never heard of. Project Sigma, Continuity Operations, memorandum dated August 19th, 1974. Authorization granted for establishment of subterranean research facility adjacent to primary testing areas. Purpose: analysis of recovered materials and biological specimens under controlled environmental conditions. Personnel assigned to Sigma operations are to maintain absolute compartmentalization. Disclosure of project details to unauthorized individuals, including other facility personnel, will result in immediate termination of employment and prosecution under relevant statutes. Jack's hands were slick on the steering wheel. Recovered materials, biological specimens. The voice was talking about things that sounded like they'd been pulled directly from a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. But the tone was so matter-of-fact, so clinical, that it was impossible to dismiss as fiction. He glanced at the GPS again. Still dead. He tried his cell phone. No signal. Not even the little indicator that showed he was searching for a tower. Just blank, as if the phone had forgotten what a cellular network was. The radio continued. The voice read memo after memo, document after document, each one describing projects and operations that sounded progressively more bizarre. References to trans-medium propulsion systems, mentions of non-terrestrial artifacts, a passage about biological entities exhibiting characteristics inconsistent with known evolutionary taxonomy. Jack reached over and turned the radio off. The voice kept talking. He stared at the dashboard. The radio's power light was off. The display was dark. But the voice continued, emanating from the speakers like it was coming from somewhere deeper than the wiring, like the sound itself had been embedded in the truck. Jack yanked the keys out of the ignition. The engine died. The headlights went dark. The truck coasted forward in silence, momentum carrying it down the highway. And still, faintly, he could hear the voice, now distorted beyond comprehension, words blending into a low hum that resonated in his chest. Then it stopped. The desert was silent. No wind, no insects. Just the sound of his own breathing and the faint tick of the cooling engine. Jack sat in the darkness for a long moment. Then he turned the key. The engine roared back to life. The headlights blazed, illuminating the empty road ahead. The radio stayed off. He drove in silence for the next hour, his mind racing, trying to rationalize what he'd just heard. Radio interference. A bizarre prank. Something to do with the cargo he was hauling. There had to be an explanation. He didn't believe any of them. Act 3. The checkpoint. Jack reached the perimeter checkpoint at 2:17 in the morning. He knew the time because he'd been watching the clock on his dashboard obsessively since the radio incident. grounding himself in the concrete reality of numbers and minutes passing. The checkpoint was a low structure of concrete and reinforced glass, floodlit by sodium vapour lamps that turned the surrounding desert into a stage set, all harsh light and deep shadow. 2 guards stepped out as Jack rolled to a stop. They wore fatigues with no insignia, no name tags, no unit patches. Their rifles were slung across their chests, not aimed but visible. One of them approached the driver's side window while the other circled the truck, a flashlight playing over the trailer's exterior. Jack rolled down the window. The guard held out a gloved hand without saying a word. Jack passed over his ID and the manifest. The guard scanned both with a handheld device, then looked up at Jack's face, comparing it to whatever photo was on file. After a moment, the guard handed the documents back. "Park at the red light," the guard said. His voice was flat, uninflected. "Leave the engine running. Do not exit the vehicle. We'll handle the offload." Jack nodded. He'd done this before, though never at this particular checkpoint. He put the truck in gear and rolled forward, following the painted yellow line on the pavement to a spot marked by a single red traffic signal mounted on a pole. The light wasn't connected to anything. It just stood there, glowing crimson against the darkness. He put the truck in neutral, engaged the parking brake and waited. Through his side mirror, he watched the guards move to the back of the trailer. They worked in silence, their movements efficient and practiced. A motorised pallet jack appeared, rolling out from somewhere beyond the floodlights. The trailer's rear door opened with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty desert. Jack reached for his dash cam. It was a cheap unit he'd installed himself, mounted on the windshield with a suction cup, recording everything through the front window in case of accidents or disputes about delivery times. The little red recording light was always on when the truck was running, except now it wasn't. Jack tapped the camera. The screen remained dark. He pressed the power button. Nothing. He traced the power cable down to where it plugged into the cigarette lighter. The connection was secure, but the camera was dead, as if someone had reached into the electronics and flipped a switch. A sound made him look up. Through the windshield he saw the guards rolling the silver container off his trailer. In the harsh floodlights, he could make out the stenciling on its side more clearly than he had at Nellis. The alphanumeric codes meant nothing to him, but below them, in smaller letters, was a phrase: USF Property. 1951 Recovery Unit. 1951. 4 years before Area 51 officially existed. 4 years after Roswell. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears. He watched the guards maneuver the container onto a flatbed truck that had appeared silently from the darkness. They secured it with straps, moving with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of repetition. How many times had they done this? How many containers had passed through this checkpoint bearing dates and labels that shouldn't exist? As the guards worked, Jack became aware of another sound. At first he thought it was the wind, but the air outside was perfectly still, the scrub brush motionless. The sound was deeper than wind, a low-frequency vibration that he felt more than heard, something that resonated in his bones and made his teeth ache. He'd heard this sound before. Every trucker who'd driven these routes had heard it at some point. The hum, the frequency. It was coming from somewhere beyond the checkpoint, out in the darkness where the floodlights couldn't reach. Jack strained his eyes, trying to see anything in that vast emptiness, but the contrast between the lights and the darkness was too extreme. He could have been staring at a wall 10 feet away or the horizon 20 miles distant. The hum grew louder, not by much, but enough that Jack could feel it in the steering wheel, a vibration that travelled up through his hands and into his chest. His vision began to swim slightly, the edges of objects blurring as if his eyes were having trouble focusing. One of the guards walked back to Jack's window. He made a sharp gesture. Leave. Now. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He released the parking brake, put the truck in gear and started to roll forward. But instead of following the road back the way he'd come, toward the checkpoint gate and the highway beyond, he found himself turning onto a different route, following yellow lights that stretched ahead into the darkness. "Wait," Jack said aloud to himself, to the empty cab. "This isn't right." But his hands kept turning the wheel. His foot stayed on the accelerator. The truck followed the lights deeper into the restricted zone, past barriers and warning signs that Jack's conscious mind screamed at him to obey. The hum was inside his skull now, a pressure that made thinking difficult. The yellow lights seemed to pulse in rhythm with it, guiding him forward like a runway. Jack tried to stop, tried to hit the brakes, but his body wasn't responding to his intentions. He was a passenger in his own flesh, watching helplessly as the truck carried him towards something his rational mind insisted could not exist. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the hum stopped. Jack's hands jerked on the wheel. The truck swerved, tyres crunching on gravel. He slammed the brakes, and the entire rig shuddered to a halt, trailer fishtailing slightly before settling. He sat there, breathing hard, his heart hammering so fast he thought he might be having a cardiac episode. Slowly, his hands trembling, he looked around. He was in the middle of the desert. No checkpoint, no guards, no yellow lights, just endless scrubland stretching away in all directions under a sky so packed with stars that it looked like someone had shattered a window into heaven. And directly ahead of him, perhaps 200 yards distant, was a structure. It wasn't a hangar. It wasn't a building. It was an opening in the ground, a ramp descending into the earth at a gentle angle, wide enough to drive a semi-truck down. The edges were smooth, too smooth to be natural, and they seemed to catch the starlight in a way that made them shimmer like oil on water. Jack put the truck in reverse. The transmission clunked. The engine revved. The wheels spun. He wasn't moving. The truck was stuck, or held, or something he didn't have words for. He tried the radio. Dead. He tried his phone. No signal. He tried the CB, flipping through channels, hoping to raise anyone, but all he got was static. The hum started again, softer this time, almost gentle, and with it came a sound he recognised. Footsteps on gravel, approaching from behind. Jack looked in his side mirror. There was nothing there. The footsteps came closer, slow, measured, the sound of boots on loose stone. Jack's hand moved to the door handle. He told himself not to open it, not to step out into the desert night where things moved in ways that couldn't be explained. But his hand was already pulling the handle, already pushing the door open, and he was climbing down from the cab, his legs moving automatically. He turned around. The desert was empty. No guards, no vehicles, nothing but sand and stars and the distant mountains. The footsteps stopped. Jack heard breathing, not his own, slower, deeper, rhythmic, like a machine. "Who's there?" he said. His voice sounded small and ridiculous in the enormous silence. No answer. Just the breathing, and beneath it, the hum. Jack looked back at the ramp descending into the earth. At the mouth of the tunnel, he could now see lettering carved into the stone, faded but legible. Project Sigma Continuity. He'd heard that name on the radio, on the broadcast that shouldn't have been playing. The voice had mentioned it, casually, as if it were just another item in a long list of classified programs. Recovered materials, biological specimens, continuity operations. Jack walked toward the ramp. He told himself to stop, to get back in the truck, to turn around and drive away even if it meant abandoning the rig and walking back to civilization on foot. But his legs kept moving, carrying him forward with a will independent of his own. The ramp's surface was strange under his boots. It looked like stone, but it felt like metal, smooth and slightly warm to the touch. The walls on either side were the same, vitrified into glass like surfaces that reflected his flashlight beam in fragmented patterns. This wasn't excavated. This was burned into the earth, carved by heat so intense that it had fused sand into something crystalline and permanent. Jack descended into the tunnel, his flashlight cutting weak angles through the darkness ahead. The hum grew louder the deeper he went, filling his ears until he couldn't hear his own footsteps anymore. The air smelled wrong, metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. The tunnel opened into a chamber. Jack stopped at the threshold, his light playing across a space that was vast and empty and utterly wrong. The walls curved in ways that hurt to look at, surfaces that seemed to bend perspective so that distances became impossible to judge. The floor was smooth and reflective like obsidian, and in its surface Jack could see lights moving beneath him, circuits or pathways that glowed with a faint blue luminescence. In the centre of the chamber was a pit. Jack approached it slowly, each step an act of will against every instinct screaming at him to run. The pit was circular, perhaps 50 feet across, its edges perfectly smooth. And from its depths came the hum, louder now, a sound that made Jack's vision blur and his stomach lurch. He reached the edge and looked down. The pit descended farther than his flashlight could reach, a shaft dropping into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the beam. But there was something moving down there, something that reflected light in patterns that shifted and changed, surfaces that appeared and disappeared like images glimpsed through running water. Jack stepped back from the edge. His boot scraped against something metallic. He looked down and saw a panel set flush with the floor, covered in symbols that weren't letters or numbers but something in between, geometric shapes that his mind tried and failed to organise into meaning. He touched the panel. The hum surged, sudden and overwhelming, and Jack's vision went white. When it cleared, he was somewhere else, not the chamber, not the tunnel. He was standing in a room that looked like a control centre, walls lined with screens and consoles, everything dark except for a single monitor glowing with green phosphorescent text. The text scrolled past too fast to read, lines of data or code or something that looked like language but followed no grammar Jack recognised. And then he heard the voice, not from the radio this time, not from speakers or hidden devices. It came from inside his head, a sound that bypassed his ears entirely and resonated directly in his consciousness. Witness, it said, not a command, a statement, a designation. Jack tried to speak, but his throat wouldn't work. He tried to move, but his body was frozen, locked in place like a statue. The voice continued. Records indicate observation of unauthorized intrusion. Standing protocols require containment and processing. However, current directives prioritize non-intervention in civilian exposure events. You will be returned to perimeter. Memory suppression will be partial to allow for documentation and dissemination through unofficial channels. This serves continuity objectives. Jack's vision blurred again. The room dissolved into static white noise that filled his senses completely. Act 4. The Files and the Fire. When Jack woke up, he was in his truck. The engine was running. The dashboard clock read 4:53 in the morning. He was parked at a rest stop outside Alamo, Nevada, 40 miles from the checkpoint, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. His head pounded. His mouth tasted like copper. Every muscle in his body ached as if he'd been working manual labour for hours. He sat up slowly, checking himself for injuries. Nothing. No cuts, no bruises, no signs of trauma. His clothes were dusty, his boots caked with fine sand, but otherwise he was intact. The trailer was empty. The cargo was gone, delivered or disappeared. Jack didn't know which. He started driving. Not back toward Las Vegas, not toward his dispatcher's office to file a delivery report. He drove to Rachel, Nevada, to the Little Alien, the roadside, a diner that had become a pilgrimage site for UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists. It was the only place Jack could think to go where people might believe what he'd experienced, or at least not call the police when he tried to explain it. The diner was nearly empty at this hour, just a handful of tourists sleeping in their cars outside, and one waitress behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a name tag that read, Margaret. Jack sat at the counter and ordered coffee. When Margaret brought it, He asked if anyone had ever talked to her about working at the base. Margaret smiled, a knowing expression that suggested she'd heard this question 1,000 times. "Everyone talks," she said. "The question is who's telling the truth and who's just repeating what they heard online." "What if someone saw something?" Jack asked. "Something they can't explain." Margaret poured herself a coffee and leaned against the counter. "Then they'd better be ready for people to call them crazy, or a liar, or a government disinformation agent. That's how it works out here. You see something real, and suddenly you're the problem, not what you saw." She gestured to the walls around them. Jack looked up and realised the entire diner was covered in photographs and newspaper clippings. Images of the base from the 50s, aerial shots showing runways and hangars, articles about the workers' lawsuits in '94, the contractors who'd been exposed to toxic waste and denied compensation. Satellite photos from recent years showing new construction, massive hangars that hadn't existed a decade earlier. One photograph caught Jack's eye. It was a surveillance shot clearly taken from a distance, showing a line of white buses parked outside a terminal. The buses had no markings, no logos, just blank white exteriors that reflected the desert sun. "Janet flights," Margaret said, following his gaze. "That's what they call them. White buses and unmarked planes that ferry workers to the base every day. Nobody knows who those people are or what they do. They sign NDAs that would make your eyes water, and every single one of them has a story about something weird happening out there. Most of them never tell it." Jack sipped his coffee. It was terrible, burnt and bitter, but it was real. It grounded him. "You hear about the new construction?" Margaret asked. She pulled out her phone, swiping through images until she found what she was looking for. She turned the screen toward Jack. It was a satellite image, dated April 20th, 2023. The photo showed Groom Lake from above, the runways and hangars clearly visible. But there was something new in the frame, a cluster of structures that hadn't been there in previous images. The buildings were massive, hangar-sized, and their roofs were covered in what looked like heat dispersion panels. "Someone ran thermal analysis on these," Margaret said. "The readings don't make sense. These buildings are generating heat signatures consistent with industrial fusion reactions. That's not airplane testing. That's power generation on a scale that shouldn't exist with current technology." Jack stared at the image. He thought about the pit, the chamber beneath the desert, the hum that had resonated in his bones. "How many people know about this?" he asked. Margaret shrugged. "Couple thousand saw it online. A few scientists commented. Then the website went down and the images got scrubbed from most of the platforms. But the internet remembers everything. You just have to know where to look." Jack spent the next week compiling everything he could find. He bought a laptop at a big box store in Las Vegas, paying cash, using a VPN to browse forums and declassified document archives. He downloaded reports from the CIA's own website, documents released under Freedom of Information Act requests, heavily redacted but still revealing. There were memos about the U-2 program, justifications for maintaining secrecy even after the aircraft was retired. There were reports about Oxcart and Have Blue and a dozen other programs with innocuous names that mask their true purpose. And buried in the footnotes and appendices were references to things that had no explanations. Anomalous radar returns, objects tracked at velocities exceeding Mach 20, incidents where test pilots reported encounters with craft that matched no known profile. Jack started recording audio journals, talking through what he'd experienced, trying to make sense of it. He mixed his own recollections with passages from declassified documents, creating a narrative that grounded the impossible in bureaucratic language. Memo dated March 8th, 1968, he recorded. Subject: unidentified aerial phenomena observed during Oxcart test flight. Pilot reports object pacing aircraft at Mach 3.2, maintaining fixed distance of approximately 500 feet. Object described as spherical, reflective, approximately 30 feet in diameter. No propulsion signature detected. Object accelerated vertically and disappeared from radar tracking at altitude exceeding 100,000 feet. incident classified under Project Silverbug protocols. He didn't know if anyone would ever hear these recordings. He didn't know if they mattered, but the act of creating them, of turning his experience into words and data, helped him feel like he wasn't losing his mind. Act 5. The Night Run. 6 years passed. Jack kept driving, kept hauling freight through the desert, though never again for EG&G or any of their subsidiaries. He avoided the routes near Groom Lake. He stopped listening to Coast AM. He tried to forget. But in July of 2019, his dispatcher called with an offer he couldn't refuse. Another high-security haul, same route, triple pay. Jack should have said no. Every instinct told him to say no. But he'd been struggling financially, the trucking industry contracting as shipping companies consolidated routes, and the money was enough to keep him afloat for 6 months. He said yes. This was during the summer of the Storm Area 51 event, the viral Facebook joke that had somehow turned into a real movement. Millions of people had pledged to see them aliens, to gather at the gates of the base on September 20th and force their way inside. The military had issued warnings. The local sheriff had held press conferences begging people not to come, but the internet didn't care about warnings. Jack picked up the truck on July 18th. The cargo manifest was blank this time, just a weight notation, 12,000 pounds. When he asked what he was hauling, the loading supervisor told him it was equipment for emergency response preparation. Nothing more. Jack drove north through the night. The highway was busier than usual. Caravans of RVs and passenger cars heading toward Rachel. Tourists and true believers making the pilgrimage to see the most famous classified base in America. Jack passed them slowly, his rig lumbering through the darkness, while cars honked and passengers waved. Some holding up signs that read, "We believe and show us the aliens." Around midnight, Jack's radio cut to an emergency broadcast frequency. The voice was automated, repeating the same message on a loop. "Attention, you're approaching restricted military airspace. Unauthorized entry is prohibited under federal law. Use of deadly force is authorized. Turn back now." Jack had heard this broadcast before on previous runs, but tonight it was different. Beneath the automated voice, he could hear other sounds, fragments of conversation bleeding through from another frequency, voices discussing coordinates, someone saying, "Containment protocol active." Another voice, calmer, repeating numbers that Jack recognized as GPS coordinates near Groom Lake. He tried to change the station. The radio wouldn't respond. The broadcast continued, overlapping voices creating a chaotic stream of information that Jack's mind struggled to parse. And then, cutting through everything else, he heard a single word repeated 3 times. Sigma. The same name from the tunnel. The same designation carved into stone. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel. He checked his mirrors. The highway behind him was empty now, the tourist traffic falling away as he approached the restricted zone. Ahead, the checkpoint loomed, but something was wrong. The guard station was dark. No floodlights. No vehicles. Jack slowed to a crawl, his headlights cutting across the empty checkpoint. The barrier gate was raised, locked in the open position. The guard station's windows were dark. No signs of life. He should have turned around. Should have driven back to Vegas and told his dispatcher the delivery was impossible. But something pulled him forward. The same compulsion he'd felt 6 years earlier. He sensed that this was inevitable, that he'd been on a trajectory toward this moment since the night he'd first heard the hum. Jack drove through the checkpoint. No one stopped him. No alarm sounded. He followed the road deeper into the restricted zone, and ahead of him, pulsing in the darkness like a beacon, he saw the red light. The same red light from before, mounted on its pole glowing crimson against the starless sky. Jack stopped the truck beneath it and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. The desert was silent. No hum, no voices, just the tick of the cooling engine and Jack's own breathing. Then the light changed from red to yellow, then to green. Jack looked at the road ahead. The pavement stretched away into darkness, but there were no other lights, no guide markers, just the green signal, permission or command, and the vast emptiness beyond. Jack put the truck in gear and drove forward, following the road until it wasn't a road anymore, until he was driving across open desert, his headlights illuminating nothing but sand and scrub. He drove until he saw it ahead, rising from the ground like a wound in the earth. The ramp, the tunnel, the entrance to something that shouldn't exist. Jack stopped the truck. He turned off the engine. In the sudden silence he could hear his heart pounding, could feel the blood moving through his veins like electricity. He climbed down from the cab, his boots crunching on sand. The air was cold, colder than it should be in the middle of summer, and there was a smell on the wind like metal and ozone. Jack walked to the ramp's entrance. The lettering was still there, carved into stone that gleamed like glass. Project Sigma. Continuity. He descended into the tunnel. His flashlight was dead, but he didn't need it. The walls glowed with that same faint blue luminescence, enough to see by, enough to navigate. The hum was back, softer than before, a vibration that felt almost welcoming. The tunnel opened into the chamber. Jack stepped through, and his breath caught. The pit was no longer empty. Something rested at its bottom, something that caught the light and bent it, surfaces shifting through colours that Jack had no names for. It was massive, easily the size of a house, and it was moving, rotating slowly on an axis that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. As Jack watched, the object began to rise. It moved in complete silence, no engines, no propulsion system visible. It simply lifted, defying gravity with the casualness of a balloon released into the wind. The surfaces reflected the chamber's blue light, casting patterns across the walls that looked like language, like diagrams, like star charts from a perspective no human had ever seen. Jack pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. He raised it, framing the rising object in the camera, and pressed record. The screen went white. The phone died in his hand, all its electronics fried by something Jack couldn't perceive. The object continued to rise, reaching the level of the chamber floor, then moving past him toward the tunnel entrance. Jack turned to watch it go. This impossible thing gliding up the ramp and out into the desert night. He followed it. When Jack emerged from the tunnel, the object was hovering above the desert floor, perhaps 50 feet up, rotating slowly. It cast no shadow despite the starlight. It made no sound, and then it moved. Not gradually, not with acceleration. It simply changed position, from hovering above the desert to being a mile away in an instant, a transition that Jack's eyes couldn't track, because it happened between frames of perception. The object disappeared into the southern sky, a point of light that faded to nothing. Jack stood in the desert for a long time after it was gone. Eventually he walked back to his truck, climbed into the cab and started the engine. His CB radio crackled to life. Jack grabbed the mic out of habit, keying it. "Tell Art Bell he was right," Jack said into the static. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, the voice of a man reporting something he had witnessed on the road. "Tell him they're real, and they've been here the whole time." He released the mic. The static continued for a moment, then resolved into silence. Jack drove. Act 6. Aftermath. They found Jack's truck 3 days later, parked at mile marker 23 on Highway 95, engine running, all lights on. The driver's door was open, the keys were in the ignition. The CB radio was still recording, 68 hours of continuous static. Jack Reeves was never found. The official investigation concluded that he'd experienced a mental health crisis and wandered into the desert, where he likely succumbed to dehydration or exposure. Search and rescue teams combed the area for weeks, using helicopters and heat-sensing equipment, but found no trace. His truck was impounded. The cargo it had been carrying, whatever it was, had vanished. The manifest showed a delivery to Site U-97, but when investigators followed up, they were told no such site designation existed and no delivery had been scheduled for that date. The audio recordings Jack had made, the journals and compiled documents, were found on his laptop at his apartment in Las Vegas. His sister listened to them once, then deleted them. She didn't want to believe her brother had been losing his mind. She didn't want the recordings to exist as evidence of his decline, but someone had already uploaded them. Before the laptop was erased, someone had copied the files and posted them to a forum dedicated to Area 51 research. The posts were deleted within hours, but by then they'd been downloaded by hundreds of people, mirrored across dozens of sites. Jack's story became one more thread in the endless tapestry of conspiracy theories surrounding the base. Some people believed it, most didn't. A few claimed they'd had similar experiences, that they'd heard the hum or seen the lights or been pulled into situations they couldn't explain. None of it could be verified. None of it was proven. But in June of 2023, 4 years after Jack's disappearance, commercial satellite imagery of Groom Lake revealed something new. A scar in the desert floor, roughly 600 feet in diameter, perfectly circular, the sand fused into glass. The heat required to create that kind of vitrification was estimated at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. No known aircraft or weapon system could generate that kind of focused thermal energy. The government offered no explanation. When journalists asked about the scar, Air Force spokespeople repeated the standard line: "We don't discuss operations at testing facilities." The scar is still there, visible in satellite images for anyone with an internet connection to see. It sits in the desert like a punctuation mark, the period at the end of a sentence that was never finished. Ending. The desert still breathes. Area 51 began as a runway for spy planes. The U-2, the Oxcart, the Blackbird, aircraft so advanced they seemed like science fiction, even to the pilots who flew them. Later came stealth technology, drones, hypersonic vehicles, each generation pushing further into realms that most people assumed were impossible. But maybe, just maybe, some of what they were testing out there wasn't built in Lockheed's Skunk Works or Northrop's Black Projects division. Maybe some of it was recovered, studied, reverse engineered from something that came from somewhere else. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe Area 51 is exactly what the government says it is. A test facility for classified aircraft, nothing more. Maybe all the lights in the sky are ours. All the strange radar returns are experimental craft. All the stories are just that. Stories told by people who saw something they couldn't explain and filled in the gaps with their imaginations. But if that's true, then why the secrecy that persists decades after the Cold War ended? Why the lawsuits that get dismissed on national security grounds? Why the satellite photos showing construction that doesn't match any known industrial purpose? Why the scar in the desert fused into glass by heat that shouldn't exist? Jack Reeves drove freight through the Nevada desert for over a decade. He was a reliable contractor, a man who followed rules and kept his mouth shut. Until the night he didn't come home, until the night he left his truck running on an empty highway and walked into the darkness. They say the desert keeps its secrets, that the sand and the wind erase everything eventually, grinding down evidence and memory until nothing remains but stories. But the desert isn't empty. It's full of things we built and things we found and things we still don't understand. And somewhere out there, beneath runways and hangars and tunnels that don't appear on any map, something is still humming, still waiting, still watching the skies for signals we can't interpret and responding in ways we're not equipped to comprehend. Area 51 is real. The documents prove it. The satellites show it. The history confirms it. What happens inside is another question. And maybe, just maybe, the answer is something we're not ready to hear. Area 51 remains an active United States Air Force operating location. Public access is prohibited. No evidence of extraterrestrial technology has ever been officially released. The lights over Groom Lake continue to appear, the hum continues to resonate, and somewhere in the desert beneath the stars the frequency still broadcasts. For those who know how to listen,